I just want to thank everyone for being here. And Yoon, of course, has been a wonderful guest of ours this whole year. And uh, we have enjoyed you so much. And so it pleases me that you're able to be with us tonight. And we look forward to what you have to tell us. So I'm going to find a seat and enjoy your presentation, Yoon.
Okay, great. Hi everyone. I can't believe it's almost June. Okay, I think if I'm looking at this correctly, we have a pretty small group, so it's good. I mean, not that not that I don't like more people, but in that more people can participate, ask questions, and things like that. Today's session I will be asking you to participate a little bit more, whether just talking or using the chat box. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So I just wanted to review where we've been and what we're doing today. I cannot believe, but the last time we met was January. But just as a review for this academic year, in August we started and we had the one-day training with America. We met on Second Life afterwards in September, where we focused on paraphrasing. And then in October, we had a focus on student thinking assessment. And then in January, we looked at argumentation. And so today, I wanted to go into something that we call framing in our paraphrasing, just as a way for you to have more advanced tools when you're working with your students, and really thinking about those kinds of skills that start to transfer into other subject areas. I have heard teachers say that framing really helps them use VTS when they're really focusing on, getting students to think critically outside of the kind of pure VTS sessions, and just as a way to think about student thinking. So before I do that, though, I'm just curious if anyone has any. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, it sounded like someone was talking, but before I get started, I wanted to just ask the group if there were any kind of burning questions that you had, or if anyone wanted to share any stories about what's been happening with BTS in classroom. And so feel free to write that in the text box on the side too at any point. I'd love to hear any questions or any stories. Okay? Is anyone having problems hearing my voice? Because I'm hearing a little funny kind of feedback, and I can't tell if that's just me and my headphones or if that's the group. Is anyone else hearing that? Everyone hearing it okay? I hope. Okay, great. So thank you. So it sounds like we have enough people saying it's okay. Great. It might just be the little feedback on my headphones. Okay. Next slide. Okay. I apologize if that slide's looking a little bit funny. The word program's actually not crossed out. It's just an underline. However, again, I just want to review where we are in our work together. And so typically when we work with teachers, we work with them for a minimum of 3 years. And this is not a strict timeline, but in general, in the first year, we focus on teacher facilitation and really just thinking about your skills as a facilitator. In year 2, we really focus less on just the mechanics of facilitation, but more on really listening and hearing student thinking. How do we support students better based on what we are hearing and learning from the students themselves? Which is not to say that's not what we're doing in the first year, but we just focus the professional development a little bit differently. And then in the third year, and again, it doesn't strictly happen in the third year. These are just more of the way that we progress our professional development, and often it gets divided into these kind of neat 3 years, but sometimes student thinking happens at the end of year 1, and synthesis about shifting BTS practices to other areas of your classroom happens much earlier. So today, focus on framing. That's both focusing on teacher facilitation and also really thinking about thinking. So that is what we're going to be doing. So next slide. All right. So again, as a reminder, and since we haven't seen each other since January, these are again goals for students that we have for VTS. You might have slightly different ones in your classroom depending on what you teach and your age group, but in general, our goals for our students is to develop flexible and rigorous thinking skills, language and listening skills, visual literacy, problem-solving abilities, curiosity, and an openness to the unfamiliar, and an ability to participate in discussions and respect for multiple viewpoints. That's a lot. And not all these things are met, right away, but these are general goals that we have. Again, I encourage you, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to type them in that side. If you want to share something by speaking, feel free. And if you want to just let me know that you want to share something, you can also tell me in the chat box so I can stop talking and not talk over you. Next, this slide, which you have all seen before. You have all seen this before. A reminder that this is the kind of facilitation skills that you've been practicing and that we've been really focusing on since we started with the summer workshop. So again, that we are always asking to start with silent looking, that you are using those 3 questions, and as facilitators, that you are listening, pointing, paraphrasing. Sometimes you link, but no big deal if you don't. And then we conclude by appreciating a skill that the students demonstrate in this discussion. Okay, next slide. All right, so today when we think about advanced facilitation skills, I'm going to focus on, in that column that says facilitators, that last box says frame and label. I'm going to focus on the framing part, which is all about how do we listen for the kind of thinking that's happening in a student comment. Okay, next slide. Again, some of this is review, but it's good to be on the same page about what we're doing. So a reminder that I'm sorry, I'm laughing because I realized one of you is sitting backwards on the chair. Okay, so basic paraphrasing, you accept every comment with neutrality in tone, facial expression, and language. We paraphrase every comment accurately, preserving the meaning intended by viewer, and this is not going to happen every time, but provide new or succinct vocab, model appropriate sentence structure and presentation of the idea. With interpretive comments, we paraphrase the comment before we ask what is it that makes you say that, and then you paraphrase again. And you begin to incorporate conditional language. So, posing things as possibilities and not certainties. Okay, next slide. So in advanced facilitation skill, the part that's highlighted in blue, this is what we're going to focus on. As a facilitator, that another tool that you have is to really describe how a student is thinking. So labeling thoughts. How is a student making meaning? So instead of just being like a thesaurus, I'm thinking about how do I reword this, really thinking about how can I label a kind of thinking that's happening here? How do I help students think about their thinking? How do I help students think about thinking in general? Okay, so next slide. So this should be a pretty familiar slide to you, I think. And this slide on the left side, when we think about VTS, we're thinking about that we're activating reasoning in a social context, that VTS happens very purposefully within a social context. So on the left side in the cognitive cycle, the students, by putting up the artwork, by asking what's going on in this picture, you are asking students to make an argument, state a hypothesis, make inferences, right? Make observations, keep looking. And because you're in a social cycle, that cognitive cycle connects to the social cycle because, and I'm going to move to the right side now, students are asked to communicate their ideas. Students are asked to listen to other students. There's critical evaluation that happens. There's a respectful debate that happens. And that social cycle feeds back into each student's cognitive cycle because they're now using new information provided by others and reframing their own assumptions and hypotheses. So the reason I put this slide up here is just to contextualize that the skill of framing as a facilitator really supports this cognitive cycle, which is to listen, which is about listening to individual comments, stepping back and thinking about what is the student doing, not just what is the student saying, but what is the student doing. Okay, next slide. It will get more clear as I give you examples. So in this slide, let's talk about what does framing sound like? What in the world am I talking about? So if we were in a VTS discussion, and this is just a little snippet from a transcript, the image on the bottom there, the student says, I think it's a family reunion and that it was like in old times. So the teacher says, so you are saying this could be a family gathering, what? I should say a long time ago, a time long ago. Okay. So you are saying this could be a family gathering a time long ago. That's a perfectly fine paraphrase. Okay. That's what that teacher did is just echoing back to that student, right? So now we're saying, as a facilitator who has more experience, let's think about how we can approach this paraphrase a little bit differently. Okay, next slide. Let's go revisiting the student comment. The student says, I think it's a family reunion and that it was like in old times. Okay, so now my question to you is, what are ways to frame this comment? And what I mean by that is, instead of thinking about what the student is saying, what kind of thinking is the student doing? In other words, for example, the student is not talking about the colors. The student is not counting how many people are in there. The student is not thinking about who the artist is. What is the student doing here? What is the kind of thinking that the student is doing? What's perhaps a big theme that the student is touching upon? So if you have thoughts on that, go ahead and write them in the chat box. Great. So Sandy is adding that this student is thinking about family. And again, I would ask you, Sandy, what is family an example of? So the student says, I think it's family reunion. And the broader thinking that the student is doing is, how are these people connected to each other? And family is an example. So the students could have said, it's a teacher and students, but it's the same kind of thinking, right? Like, how do these people know each other? Like, how are they connected to each other? And the student's saying it's a family reunion. Here, Autumn Maker says, noticing culture clues. So another thing that the student's doing, I would actually ask you, Autumn Maker, what culture clues is the student noticing? Autumn Maker, that is your real name. I love it. What makes you say old times? Okay, so I'm gonna ask you to think about this differently. So the thing about framing is stepping outside of what the student has said and think, what is the student doing, right? And the doingness of thinking about old times, Autumn, like you're saying, is the student is thinking about time period. Okay, so I'm gonna walk us through this a little bit. Can I have the next slide? And by the way, it's a lot more straightforward than I'm making this sound. All right, so a way to frame your paraphrase and to think about the student comment is to step away from just the words, but think about, how is a student approaching this picture, right? And so these are just examples. There's no one perfect answer. So Autumn, we don't know that this person is doing that yet. She might be, right? Because Autumn, you're saying she's noticing clothes, bonnet, chicken. Maybe, we don't know that yet, right? But just from this comment, I think it's a family reunion and that it was like in old times. What have we learned about the student, right? And so here's some examples, because Autumn, you're jumping ahead to thinking about what the student might answer. I'm saying, what do we know about how the student is thinking just from this one comment? I think it's a family reunion and that it was like in old times. So these underneath on this slide, those quotes are examples of framing, what framing sounds like in a paraphrase. So one example is you're talking about what these figures are doing as well as when this could have happened. All right. So you see in this comment, the teacher has stepped back from the student comment and is labeling the kind of thinking, the kind of meaning making that student's doing. So talking about what the figures are doing, and then the word when, right? So really echoing back to the student, this is the kind of thinking you're doing. You're thinking about what the students are doing, what the figures are doing. You're thinking about when this could have happened, okay? The next example, you're thinking about how these figures might be related to each other. So in other words, the teacher heard the comment, I think it's a family reunion. And instead of the teacher saying, what's a different way of saying family reunion, the teacher is saying, the kind of thinking that the student is doing is thinking about how these figures might be related to each other. Okay? So taking away, not thinking about like family reunion or the event itself, but thinking about what's the thinking. The thinking is like, how are these people related? All right, so the next one says, so you are thinking about when in time or history or how long ago the scene might be from, right? Because the student said it was like in old times. And what the teacher is hearing is, oh, the kind of thinking that the student is doing is she's thinking about when in time this thing took place. Okay? I hope that makes sense. I know it sounds like, what? But a way to think about it, the reason we use the word frame is that we're stepping outside of the picture and thinking about one step removed, that like the frame around the picture, right? Like what's the way that the student is approaching that picture to make meaning from it. Okay, next slide. And what I have noticed that anytime I've introduced framing, it's a lot more straightforward, right? It sounds a little bit like what, because it's a shift, but let's try this one. This is from another student. So I'm sorry, I don't have the picture up, but the student comment is, it's a horse or maybe a mule. So my question to you, and go ahead and write in the chat box, what are ways to frame this comment? So another way to think about it is, what's the kind of thinking that the student is doing when, I'm going to just call it a she, I don't know if it's a she or a he, but when she says it's a horse or maybe a mule, what's the kind of thinking that's happening here? So Sandy, you're saying, so you are thinking of an animal that can be ridden. I'm laughing because I'm like, you're right, you could write both those animals. I never thought of it that way. So that's one. Okay, other thoughts about that? You're suggesting that the figures are animals that are similar. Sandy, that's true, without a picture. Okay, great. So both those ideas are that you're stepping back and thinking about what the students say, what the student is thinking about, right? Okay, so a really simple way of thinking about what the kind of thinking that the student is doing is you are wondering what sort of animal this might be. So simply put, how the student is making meaning, how the student is approaching this is trying to figure out and identify the kind of animal that's in this picture. Okay, and yes, the other suggestions are great too. Again, there's no one way to do this, but this is a different kind of paraphrasing. Right? Like a basic one this year, if I was in your classroom and I heard you say, if a student said it's a horse or maybe a mule, and you said, okay, so you're looking at this animal and maybe it's a horse or a mule. Okay, what more can we find? That's a perfectly great paraphrase. What I'm asking now is to step back and reflect to the students, what's the kind of thinking that you're hearing? Not just the words, but what's the kind of thinking? So another way would be, you are noticing the animal in this picture and you're thinking about what kind of animal it could be. So one frame that I just offered there is labeling that the student's eyes went to a particular place. And then the other frame that I'm offering is that the student is also wondering, trying to figure out, puzzle over what kind of animal this is. Okay. All right, so Autumn, that's a really good question. Actually, that's part of one of the slides. It's what's the benefit of labeling this framing? And I'm going to we'll do more of this, but I will throw that back to the group. What's the purpose of framing. And you don't do it every time. This is just another tool in your toolkit that you could use. So when would you use this kind of paraphrasing? I'll throw that out to the group. And also, can I move to the next slide? So another example, and Autumn, if no one responds, I will come back to you, so I'm not ignoring it. So another example of framing, a student writes here, look at that nasty frown, for sure she's upset, right? So another way to look at that comment to respond. So next slide. So the teacher can say, to you, her facial expression, a serious frown, is indicating how she might be feeling in this picture. So again, a slightly different way of paraphrasing to highlight more of what that student is doing. Okay, let me go back to the chat box. So Sandy, you wrote, we might use it to narrow down what the idea is that the kid is trying to get across. Yep. Would framing help with other students' thinking and encourage them to make a response? Absolutely. So what we do quite often in framing is that we take away, for example, if in a conversation one student's like, that's a mule, and another kid's like, no, that is a horse, a response, instead of just paraphrasing, like, okay, so you also think it's a horse. Okay, you don't think it's a horse, you think it's a mule. The way that framing can help is say, okay, you're both looking at this animal in this picture and thinking about what it could be, and we have a couple different ideas about it. And so it's one way to kind of step away and show students that they're kind of doing the same thing. They might be having a different conclusion, but also showcasing to the rest of the students that there are different approaches, or there might be a same approach, and coming to different ideas. And so it's just kind of helping students think about different ways of trying to understand a picture. I think it allows to aspire the process of thinking versus accepting, locking specific answers and accepting them as truth. Exactly. And it really well said. So this idea that we're not just being like, yes, that's a mule or that's a horse, but the beauty of trying to decode or deconstruct an image is that we're saying that we're trying to say this is about thinking. And so if our paraphrases are actually identifying and labeling the thinking as opposed to just like the quote unquote answer, it supports that kind of skill around thinking, and an awareness about thinking. And that sounds more complicated than it is. Sometimes it's simply, oh, you're drawing our attention to the center of this picture. The student may have never said that. The student might simply have said, I see a red ball. But for us to simply say, you're drawing our attention to the center of this picture, and it can welcome and encourage all sorts of kind of looking all over the picture. Okay, and it also makes the student aware that that's what she did. She may just been like, wait, what? I was just looking at the ball. But it's to also step back and say, you're doing a thing. You've made a choice to look at one thing in the picture. Sandy, I think it would also inspire kids to offer alternatives than they are respectfully commenting on the thoughts of others. Hi, Shafonda. I think it inspires students to dig deeper with their views. I hope so. I think it can. I totally agree. So Autumn, thank you for bringing up that question, and thank you for all these comments. Hi back, Shafonda. Okay, so next slide. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, great. Thank you. So again, just in support, you all brought up really great points. These are just kind of sentence starters. I know that sometimes when we're starting and thinking about a new skill, it's sometimes easy to be given like a script, just to give you kind of an easier way to start thinking about framing. Here, some sentence starters. So for example, when you hear the appropriate comment, you say things like, you're identifying a time period of when this could be taking place, or you're talking about the setting about where this could be taking place. Another way of thinking about framing is this pinpointing and location language. So, for example, you're looking to the right of the girl, or you're drawing our attention to the foreground. So again, it's labeling the behavior of students, the thinking and behavior of students, not just the words. Okay. And then this last category is this labeling and metacognition. You're inferring from this. You're wondering about this. You're talking of the process of how this artwork was made. You're referring to another text. So, by the way, I hear teachers say things like, you're making a text to life connection, or you're making it, especially when you hear students talk about movies, you can say, oh, so you're making a text to text connection. The text here being the artwork, and the other text was a film that you saw. And the connection that you made is blah, 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 blah. And then another example, another sentence starter is, you're seeing this detail as a symbol of. So again, it's kind of just fleshing out more of what the student is doing. Okay, again, so these are words that just for us on staff, I know that just in different schools that we've worked at, these are some words that teachers are often asked that students learn how to do. Like not that they're asked to use the words, but these are kind of skills that you're asked to really develop in students, like clarifying, elaborating, identifying, finding evidence, revising. And so the nice thing about framing, what we're asking you to do is just to call it out when you hear students doing that thing that you want them to do. So simply to say, oh, so you're elaborating here. So you're speculating that, et cetera, or you're interpreting this as, you're predicting this, and the evidence that you provide, or the evidence that you found to support your prediction is, blah, 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 blah. So the idea here is like, it's finding those teaching moments of these kind of skills, like thinking skills that you want your students to have, and using moments and listening for those moments where you can just label it for them. Like, this is a thing that you're doing, you're revising, you are comparing. And so it's just a great kind of tool to make that, to make it evident, right? Just to call it out. And so that the next time when you're, working with your students and you're saying, we need more clarification, elaborating, you could even refer back, like, remember in VTS when you gave that great elaboration on blah, 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 do more of that. So I want to do another example with you all as a group, okay? So this is a student comment from the picture that you see up there, which you probably, for those of you who teach 3rd grade and higher, that you may have seen. Okay, the student says they're playing on swings and it's an apartment building back there. All right, so go ahead and write in the chat box here. What are ways to frame this comment? And remember, there's no one perfect answer, so go ahead and just write some ideas there. What are ways to frame this comment? They're playing on swings and it's an apartment building back there. What's the kind of thinking that the student's doing? How is the student trying to make sense? Right? Okay, so Sandy, you write, you are noticing the children on swings and drawing our attention to the background. Perfect. So the first thing that you're doing, the framing that I'm hearing in your comment, you're noticing. So just even putting that word in there, the student didn't say, I'm observing. I mean, the student didn't say anything like that, but you are labeling that behavior. So you're noticing the children on the swings and then drawing our attention. So again, putting a label to the behavior that's happening here, drawing our attention to the background of the picture again. So kind of that pinpointing language. The student didn't say, I'm looking up front and now I'm going to the back. The student just said two things, and then Sandy, you're labeling both the thinking that's happening, the noticing, and then you're also labeling the background there, and that the drawing our attention to there. So Autumn, you put, you're noticing the actions that are happening in the foreground and noticing the background. Oh my gosh, those are both really great ways. Exactly, to frame that. So Autumn, you said noticing the actions that are happening in the foreground. Great. So instead of just being like, oh, they're playing on swings, what that student is doing is noticing the actions that are happening in the foreground, that there is activity there. So, and then noticing the background. Great. And then Shafanda, so you recognize the building is an apartment building. What makes you say, I would say, what do you see that makes you say it's an apartment building? Yeah, so one thing that you're doing there, and I would say you could, Shafanda, even push that more, is that where you put, you recognize the building as an apartment building, you could even say you're noticing the building and identifying what kind of building it is. That's kind of like what you're saying. And then asking that question, what do you see that makes you say that? So great. So again, really just kind of pulling apart what that student's doing. Okay, next slide. So these are, again, what you all wrote there, Autumn and Sandy and Shafanda. Those are great examples. And then just to add to that list, really simple things. You are considering what these figures are doing, right? You're identifying the kind of structure in the background, kind of Shafanda, what I was saying to you. You're observing figures in the picture really simply, kind of like Sandy, what you're doing, like you're noticing the children. And then you have brought two areas of this picture to our attention, kind of like what you were doing there, Autumn, like calling out that there's two areas to be noticed here. Okay, great. Next slide. I just wanted to share, this slide. So my colleague, who's a VTS trainer, her son goes to a school that does VTS, and she said he brought this home one day in second grade. So he wrote in response to his teacher's question about what's going on in this picture. He wrote, and they typed it up because the handwriting's hard to read. It looks like in the background there's Indians that's going to kill animals, right? And the teacher wrote, the only thing the teacher wrote in response was just kind of framing. It was a framing paraphrase. So in orange, the teacher wrote, "You are thinking about the situation in this image." And that's it. So anyway, my colleague sent that to me. She goes, "Look at this teacher. All he did was frame it for him, and it was like a nice affirmation of, I hear you." Didn't try to make the student feel bad, whether it's right or wrong, but just kind of making a positive thing that you were thinking about the situation in this image. And that was the response. Okay, next slide. So I took, again, from my colleagues in Portland, they gave me a transcript of an exchange, of a VTS discussion in a classroom. And we thought it was a really good example of how student thinking in that classroom evolved just from the teacher's tools of facilitating and paraphrasing. So I wanted to read this out to you, and then we can talk about it. However, can I get a volunteer? Actually, can I have two volunteers? One to read what the student says, and it's not the same student every time, but one just to be the voice of the students, and one person to read the teacher comments. There's only 4 exchanges altogether. Would anyone like to volunteer that? I know some of you are at home and can't and have everything on mute or on headphones, but anyone available to read one of those 2 parts? All right, you're stuck with my voice. Okay, next slide. So as I read this conversation, think about these 2 questions. Actually, can you go, Ula? Can you go back to the previous slide? So think about these 2 questions. How does student thinking evolve in this conversation, and what VTS elements does the facilitator use? Okay? All right, next slide. All right, student says, there are 2 boys playing basketball, taking turns. One boy is shooting and the other boy is blocking the shot. Facilitator, you are seeing 2 boys at play and you think they might be taking turns. What do you see that makes you say that one boy is blocking the shot? Student, he has his hands up in the air trying to block the ball from going into the basket. He's jumping up and waving his hands in the air, trying to make the guy miss. Okay, and now here, the facilitator says, so you are looking closely at the position of their bodies. To you, the arms are up to prevent the basketball from going into a basket. What more can we find? Okay, so my question for you is, what are you noticing about what the facilitator does? Do you see any examples of framing? And what else are you noticing about the facilitator? And it could be good or it could be a criticism, doesn't matter. But I want us to slow down and look at what the facilitator does in response and tell me what you're noticing. Examples of framing, anything else that bubbles up, anything else that you're noticing about the choices that the facilitator is making. And feel free to write it on the side there. Are we looking for better framing or more? No, thank you, Adam, for asking. Just looking for, what do you notice that the facilitator is doing? Do you notice if she is framing, what examples, or anything else that you're noticing about the facilitator and the choices that she's making? So I'll start. One of the things that I notice that the facilitator does right away is really that conditional language, which we haven't been talking about today, but I think it really helps the conversation. So the first thing, the first sentence in the first paraphrase, she says, "You are seeing two boys at play and you think they might be taking turns," right? And so I think that just introducing that kind of language keeps it really open, that this is just one student and it's just one possibility. So she didn't say, "You are seeing two boys and they are taking turns, but that they might be." And then again, she says, okay, not only is the facilitator framing with words like "you are seeing," so that's already in the first sentence. And again, I would say this, they're also doing that with the phrase, "so you are looking closely at the position of their bodies." Then she paraphrases student talk. So great. So Sandy is noticing that the facilitator in both cases actually just starts by phrase "you are seeing," and then "you are looking closely at their bodies." Dean, you're saying the facilitator is asking for evidence from the student. Yep. So in both cases, it's asking for evidence, and then she mentions the positions of the body, not just that they are blocking, which moves your eyes to the movement of the whole body. Great. So the thing that I'm going to take all of those together. And what you as a group just have noticed right there is that the teacher right away frames by saying "you are seeing," "you are looking closely." Sandy, you also noticed that then she paraphrases the student comment, like just actually takes the words and reflects it back to the students, and then also then follows up with, "what do you see that makes you say that?" And I would also add that the teacher also adds in that conditional language that the "might be." And so the facilitator has done a few things. It's simple framing, right? And Autumn, you also mentioned that in that second one, it's actually a more deeper framing. It's not just "you're looking closely," but instead of repeating like "the hands are up in the air" and all of that stuff, she's saying what you're doing is looking at the positions of their body. And what you're noticing, Autumn, is that what that lets you do is that you go and notice the positions of their bodies too, as someone who's just listening to that comment. Okay, so what I'm doing here and what you're all doing is slowing down, looking at the choices that the facilitator made and what that does for students. And I would even argue that we are students in this too, just as viewers listening. Okay, next slide. So by the way, there are 4 of these slides, so we're on the second. So student says, "The boy blocking the basket doesn't have an arm." Facilitator says, "You agree that this boy might be trying to cut off or intercept the ball. What do you see that makes you say he doesn't have an arm?" Student responds, "I see one hand behind his head, but on the other side, I only see a shirt. Nothing else." Facilitator, "You are not seeing a left arm on the front side of this figure. What more can we find?" Okay, so tell me, so again, I'm going to just throw this back to you all. What are you noticing about how this conversation is evolving? What is the facilitator doing? What are some of the choices that she's made in facilitating? And I'll start off in the same way I did last time with what I'm appreciating about the facilitator is she starts with, "You agree that this boy might be trying to cut off or intercept the ball." So in that one sentence, the teacher linked the comment by saying "you agree." The teacher also keeps the conversation open by using the word "might." And then the teacher also gives a different way of saying the words. The student says the boy is blocking the basket. And the facilitator uses the phrases cut off or intercept the ball. And so she said a lot, just not one sentence. And then let me know if you notice anything else. And then she also, in that first paraphrase, so she's doing a lot. She's linking, she's giving different ways of saying the term blocking the basket. And she's taking that interpretive line, which is doesn't have an arm. Wait, Sandy, I'm going to read your comment. You said, she is drawing attention to the focus on the arm or lack of arm. This opens up for further comments from other students. Exactly, Sandy. So, Sandy, what you're noticing is that when you're asking that question, what do you see that makes you say that? The teacher, that you all have a choice of what you're going to follow up on. And what you're noticing there is by drawing attention to that one piece, it opens it up to more discussion, right? And you may have noticed that the way the facilitator responds when the student says, I see one hand behind his head, but on the other side, I only see a shirt. The facilitator is not saying, okay, so the person doesn't have an arm. All she says is, you are not seeing a left arm on the front side of this figure, right? So that it keeps it, she's validating what the student is observing, but she's not saying it's right or wrong, okay? Autumn, you're saying she's using really specific language to the space and item the student is talking about. Left arm, front side. Thank you, Autumn. I didn't even notice that, but I totally agree with you that she is kind of teaching specific language here. It's not hard vocabulary, but it's giving, kind of practicing like really specific words and that kind of pinpointing language. The left arm, front side. Student never said any of those things. But she's giving that language. And so again, these are all teaching moments that the teacher is finding and using. Thank you. Okay, next slide. Okay, so a student says, I see their shadows on the ground. Teacher says, you are bringing our eyes to the ground beneath the figures and you are identifying shadow. What do you see that makes you say that these are their shadows? And she's pointing while she says that. The student, the shape of the ground is the same as the shape of their bodies and the ball too. Facilitator says, so you are comparing the shapes. What more can we find? Okay, now what are you noticing about the facilitator? What are the kind of teaching moments she has found? What are the choices she's making and responding? So just to start again, the student simply said, I see their shadows on the ground. Okay, so that's the student comment. And the facilitator in response says, you are bringing our eye to the ground beneath the figures, and you are identifying shadow. What do you see that makes you say that these are their shadows? So what do you think about that paraphrase? What is she doing there? And same thing for that second comment. The student says the shape on the ground is the same as the shape of their bodies and the ball too. And all she says is not all that she says, but what she says is, so you are comparing the shapes. What more can we find? So I'll just start that. So for me, there's a lot happening in that first paraphrase, but what I love about the simplicity of that second paraphrase where she says, so you are comparing the shapes, it's really simple. She doesn't go back and being like the shape on the ground is the same as the bodies. She just kind of steps back and frames the student thinking. It's all the things that the student said in the comment is about comparing the shapes. And in some ways, for me, that makes me think like, oh, yeah, that is what the student's doing. That's great. We always love when students compare and contrast. But it also makes me think about different ways that I can assess an image myself. That one way to look and talk about a picture is to actually compare things that I see in there. Other thoughts on that? That other comment where she says, you're bringing our eyes to the ground beneath the figures and you're identifying shadow. Again, it's even the student, all the student said was, I see their shadows. The facilitator is bringing everyone's attention to the fact that the student is looking at one part of the picture, and that by a student saying, I see their shadows, is a student, the kind of thinking that student did is actually identifying that area. Okay, next slide. So this is the last slide from this conversation transcript. So Nikki, you wrote, she is bringing everyone's attention to the space beneath the figures. She's using the word beneath. That is a word that possibly be new to my first graders. Yeah. So Nikki, thank you. So a few things that you're saying there. One is the teacher is not only labeling what the student did, but it's also bringing the whole class, bringing everyone's attention to the space beneath the figures, right? So another way to kind of chunk out the image for people is to say, like, now we're looking here, like, beneath the figures. And also maybe some students weren't even thinking about, that there's something happening beneath the figures, beyond the figures. And then thinking about the word beneath, that it might be a new vocabulary instead of under, or just like, instead of saying just something over here or just pointing, using a word like beneath could be a good teaching moment. But also, Nikki, bringing our attention to the fact that we should always be student-centric. So using words that are appropriate to our students. So one word might be more helpful than others depending on your students and their ages. Okay, so last comment, the last slide of this. Well, I know we can't see his arm very well, but if you look at the shadow, you can see the arm there. So I think he has two arms. One is just blended in with the fence. Facilitator says, you have examined the shadow to make sense of what is going on with his body. The shadow of the arm for you is easier to read than the body. What more can we find? Okay, so what I want to ask you, as we've read all 4 slides of this conversation, how has the student thinking evolved in this conversation? What do you notice about how this conversation flowed or progressed or changed? Along with that is, what did the facilitator do to create that conversation to happen? So Nikki, you're writing that the student has realized that most likely the arm is there, but it just can't be viewed in this particular angle. Yeah, and again, I don't know if it's the same student. The first, one student says it's a kid with one arm, and then now the student is saying, well, I can see the arm better in the shadow. And so regardless of whether the same student or not, Nikki, you're noticing that, let's just say as a class, that most likely the arm is there, but it just can't be viewed in this particular angle of the photo. And then as a follow-up to you, Nikki, or whoever wants to answer, is how did the teacher support that conversation to flow that way? What are the choices she made as a facilitator for that conversation to flow that way? Sandy, you wrote, even if it is a different student, the discussion is building on ways that was previously stated. Yeah, totally agree. And Autumn, seems like they are zooming in on the picture to really dissect meaning and justify their conclusions with evidence. Yeah, exactly. So Autumn, I would agree with that and support that by also saying the fact that they're looking at that picture for a long time, this is just a snippet of their discussion. So it's simply through the act of close looking, but also that the facilitator, that as a teacher, she kept it open. She used like could be, might be, so welcoming other possibilities. She also did things like, you're bringing our attention to, what's happening beneath them. So inviting people to take a closer look, but also directing their looking based on what students are saying. So again, it's like that close looking, that directed looking. And then I like that word they use, Autumn, that zooming in, because it's like a photograph. It's like they're looking at the picture as a whole and then going in for details. Again, the teacher's simply building on what students are saying. And then she's saying things like, oh, you're noticing the shadow, you're identifying a shadow. Oh, you're comparing the shapes. So she's both letting the student know what, he or she is doing, but also inviting other students to do that too, right? And through that, there's some revision that happens, really close looking that happens. And then Autumn, as you said, because she keeps asking, what do you see that makes you say that? It asks students to have that habit of giving evidence, but it also helps other students understand how students are looking at it or not looking at it. And this is the last slide. And this is a great question, Autumn, that you already asked us, but What kinds of learning and growth could framing support? And don't worry about the second one, but what kinds of learning and growth could framing support? You all have really great answers to that. If you, after seeing that transcript and kind of going through these slides, if you want to add any other thoughts or questions in response to this slide. So again, what kinds of learning and growth could framing support? Please feel free to add to the chat box there. And then I just want to say, for me, as this is the last VTS check-in, please feel free to write me with any questions, either about this or about just VTS practice in general. But I'm hoping that tonight's presentation kind of just gives you more tools as you have settled into VTS practice, that this gives you another set of tools to use in your class. So it's 8 o'clock. And Peggy, did you have any kind of things that you needed to talk to the group about before we all finished?
Thank you, Yoon. Not specifically. I just want to remind people that our next class is, there's not a great deal of time between this class and the next one, so we will scheduled for June 6th. So I just want to remind you of that. But I also am listening to tonight's presentation. I'm just thinking about, in our world today, all the complicated issues and how we need our kids to learn that they're open to multiple interpretations. And I think that framing and the kinds of things that happen in VTS create a foundation for the kinds of thinking that all of our children are going to need to be lifelong learners. I'm just always impressed with, the work of VTS. And thank you, Yoon, for being here and sharing with us and helping us learn so much this year. It's greatly, greatly appreciated.
Thank you to all. And I have to say, I really appreciate the comments that were coming there. I noticed some things about the student comments and the teacher comments that I hadn't before. So thank you for contributing that way. And I know not everyone can. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Have a great rest of the week. Thanks, everyone.